Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for February 18th, 2026, and I'm Jada Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, as we hawk out on this episode. One of us might
Wow.
turn green, the other red. Who knows? We'll see how it goes.
For a second, I thought you said Hawkeye. It's like the
Or
wrong
Hawkeye,
kind of
too.
inflection.
We could Hawkeye, we could Hawk out, either one. It's all MCU related.
Well, and at least between you and I, we have a little bit of a red scheme going on with our respective attires. So I guess we are channeling our inner Red Hulk energy for this one.
Yeah. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I tend to lean more green than red usually. So hopefully, fingers crossed, my inner Hulk is the green kind. That's what I would prefer. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
You have the green
Beggars
in the
can't be
background.
choosers.
Your lighting in the background is very green, so you're able
Yeah.
to compensate for the other Hulk side of things there.
Yeah, so we'll see how it goes, but yeah, we are here to talk about the latest entry into the MCU, Captain America: Brave New World. After not getting a whole lot yet last year, we technically did get Deadpool and Wolverine, but
Yeah.
of course that's a little bit of the Fox crossing over. It's a pseudo entry into the MCU.
That's a good question, or at least it's kind of a question we can raise about Deadpool and Wolverine. Is that really an MCU film when you think about it?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, it obviously comments on the MCU and the state of Marvel, but it's not what you would consider a canonized entry.
No.
I mean, it is and it isn't.
It feels
I don't know.
more.
It's
It feels
in
more like.
purgatory.
I know that's the thing. It feels more like a Marvel Studios film than it does an MCU film, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
Yeah, because it's certainly commenting on that. But you're right. It was definitely more of an epilogue of sorts to the Fox universe, more specifically.
Well, and that's the thing with Deadpool. Deadpool always sits in this weird purgatory state because it also wasn't part of the X-Men either. It was on the fringes,
Yeah, and he knew
commenting
that.
on the
And he
X-Men
knew that.
franchise.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think it's fair to say we went through an entire year without any MCU film. So to have a year off, and now we're coming back into 2025 with 3 entries, it's going to be interesting to see how audiences respond.
Yeah, you would think during that time, a year off, they would have taken that time to get their movies right.
Well, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. I guess maybe this is an appetizer where we can set the table a little bit and talk about our thoughts on the MCU pre-leading our dinner conversation on Captain America: Brave New World. I generally have really enjoyed the MCU, as is the case with every franchise. It has its hits, it has its misses, its highs and its lows. But on the whole, I've really enjoyed it. The discourse, on the other hand, not for me. Have never really enjoyed the exhausting, extremely vapid discourse that hits social media. However, in these kinds of settings, I have always mostly enjoyed the Marvel discourse or the Marvel conversations you can have, because you can talk about things like nuance and complexities, and not everything is black and white, it turns out. And those are more fun discussions.
Yeah,
I think.
those are more fun discussions. The less fun discussions are when people are making up stories how we're now starting to dislike the MCU when everyone quote unquote hated Captain America the First Avenger when that first came out and hated Thor when that first came out. No, phase 1 rules and has always ruled. Stop making up stories, people. And that's where I think the discourse gets even more annoying, to me at least, when there's more of an agenda building around fake narratives to define or at least defend a current viewpoint on certain things.
Yeah, I have more thoughts on that as we get into the conversation on Brave New World, but
Okay.
I have always loved phase 1. I loved most of phase 2, and I quite enjoyed a lot of phase 3. Hell, I probably liked more of phase 4 than most others seem to.
There were some good things there.
I do agree that phase 4 was probably the weakest of them. And then they introduced the television series, the mini series, to couple the movie entries into the MCU. And that I do think is where the MCU really started to murky the waters.
That's
Ironically, even though I do think it came out of the gates quite strong with WandaVision and Loki, those two I still maintain are some of the best entries in the MCU. I love those two series. And even Agatha was a fun little surprise.
I like Agatha.
Last year. Loki season 2 was really good. So that element of the television side of the MCU, I still think is really good. However, on the whole, it's been a little murky, to say the least. And in terms of the continuity of it all, it's raised even more questions than what the films were doing on their own as well. So the last 4 years have been
it's
a little bit of a bumpy road.
It's really just been phase 5 when you really think about it, because I'm with you that phase 4 had some good things. I have to honestly, I'm at a point now, I don't even know what was in phase 4 versus phase 5 anymore. I can't even keep track anymore. If Eternals was part of phase 4, then I'd say I like phase 4 a little bit more than most people as well.
Here, I can tell you, just to
okay, thank you. Please educate me again.
Phase 5 was Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, LOL. Then Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, good movie, really good movie. The Marvels, and then last year with Deadpool and Wolverine. Captain America, Brave New World, and Thunderbolts are technically part of Phase 5. So we are rounding out Phase 5 with those two films, with Fantastic Four setting up the next phase.
With that slate of films that you just laid out there, I don't even count Guardians Volume 3 in that conversation, because that's something that James Gunn was working on for quite some time, even before many of these problems facing Marvel became even more problematic. So, like, that's, if anything, that's kind of an outlier. The rest of these, especially starting with Quantumania, I think that's when people really started to notice the seams starting to break. That's when Marvel really turned more into content, began cutting corners to make their films more of a narrative journey, as opposed to how it used to be going into a phase 1 film or even a phase 3 film, feeling like, oh, I'm going to go see this new political thriller style superhero movie. Now it's more about what plot points are they going to start wrapping up next. Like, these movies are starting to feel like obligations. And I think that's because Marvel is recognizing that. They're recognizing that this multiverse thing hasn't really been working. And now they have to start cleaning things up. And these movies, at least phase 5 especially, has felt like cleanup more than anything else.
And that's the issue. They had a direction, and then they had to change. Partially because of the Jonathan Majors of it all, for sure. And that was outside of their control. But also, it just wasn't working.
Yeah.
And they needed a new narrative direction as well. To further clear up the conversation here, Phase 4, the films included this: Black Widow, Shang-Chi, Eternals, Spider-Man No Way Home, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, Thor Love and Thunder, and Black Panther Wakanda Forever. I think that crop is better than the discourse would have you believe. Now there are some not good films there.
There
for
are.
sure.
Yeah.
But I think there are some, like, I think mostly it's not that bad.
Phase
Like on the
4
film
yeah.
side, it's not bad.
Well, I was just going to say, Phase 4 starts to get a little problematic when you lump in the Disney Plus content.
Well, and
alongside
that's
that.
why I wanted to have a separate conversation, because I do agree, and that's what I was alluding to a moment ago. But
Yeah.
if we're just talking about the films, Black Widow, not really the right spot for that film, and
Yeah, it came
perhaps
out at
you
the
can
wrong
point
time.
to that as being an indicator of where things were going to go post
Yeah,
Endgame.
definitely a precursor of things to come.
Absolutely. Not great, but I really liked Shang-Chi. I
Sure.
really loved Eternals. I thought Spider-Man No Way Home was really fantastic. I like Doctor Strange maybe more than most. Certainly, I like it more than Brendan. Thor: Love and Thunder, for me, is one of the worst MCU films. But
Oh, it is
Black
the worst
Panther-
one. It is the worst
fair,
one.
totally fair. Totally fair. Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, I also quite liked. So, like,
Sure.
on the film side, I don't think that's a terrible crop. I really don't. But to your point, Brendan, and as I mentioned a moment ago, the introduction of the TV side of it is where things get murky. Again, WandaVision, I really like. Loki, I really like.
Loki's
The Falcon
great.
and the Winter Soldier, which is going to be a big part of this conversation as we get into the new Cap film, I thought was okay. I didn't love it, but when it's at its best, I think it's really good. But I do think it's a little uneven.
It has an identity crisis, is what I think is big. That's the show's biggest problem. I think it sticks the landing fairly well. I think the final
I
episode
agree.
was fairly
I
good.
totally agree. Totally
Yeah.
agree. Moon Knight, somewhat of the same thing. I think that film that series is actually really fun. It's weird and
actually not
strange and
it's not a
surreal.
very good series, but it's at least weird and at least commits to being
what
a
the
little
hell?
bit different. So I have a lot of respect
Yeah.
for it.
Totally agree. And then Miss Marvel, like, I think it's endearing. I want to really like it, but I do think it's also disjointed.
It gets shackled by the 6-episode format that has actually plagued
Yeah.
many of these Disney
Yeah.
Plus shows.
And then She-Hulk I also really liked, but it feels like it doesn't have any stakes to it. And that's kind of the charm of that show, I guess.
It knows it's an outlier, so I kind of
Yes.
appreciate that about it.
But I don't completely dislike it. So that is to say, I think the introduction of the TV series was, wasn't great. And then you get to in phase 5, you got Secret Invasion, absolutely terrible. Echo, mostly forgettable. Loki was good. Agatha was good. And then we haven't seen Daredevil yet. That I think comes out in about a month's time.
It comes out in March.
not-
I think the
if I'm
first 2
mistaken.
episodes come out in March.
And then Ironheart, which hasn't been released yet either. That's coming out in the summertime.
I forgot
So
that was
those-
even still happening.
Yeah, so those two are TBD. I don't have a whole lot of expectations for Ironheart. That could be
Yeah.
another Miss Marvel in terms of execution.
Yeah, that's what I'm
That's
thinking.
also 6 episodes. Daredevil Born Again, though, I do have high hopes for, because they are regurgitating a formula that we know worked on the Netflix side.
Yeah.
Hopefully, fingers crossed, on the Disney side, they can continue
Yeah.
the trajectory that Netflix left off with. And also, that is 9 episodes. So it's not quite beholden to the 6-episode format. So it'll be able to breathe at least a little bit more.
Yeah, hope so.
But on the whole, you look at the slate from 4 to 5, where we're at now, on the TV side, a lot to be desired.
Yeah.
And it's also, in terms of the larger continuity MCU storytelling, I feel like it's left more questions than we've gotten answers on anything.
Yeah. Well, that's why so much of Phase 5, as I mentioned earlier, and we'll certainly talk about this with Brave New World, we might be playing some of our cards a little bit early, but a lot of these films are starting to feel like cleanup. Like there's a mess that needs sweeping, right? There's a lot of loose ends dangling that these movies, and Thunderbolts might fall into the same camp as well, because from what I understand, Thunderbolts also was I don't want to say plagued by reshoots and rewrites and updates, but I do think that's a film that did have some creative shifts midway through production. Although I feel like that narrative was kind of baked into the release of Captain America Brave New World. I feel like everyone going into this movie, whether you're a Marvel fan or not, you kind of already knew about the production issues plaguing this movie. And in many ways, it does feel like it's very much beholden to some of these initial ideas that Marvel is trying to shift gears into something else. And it does become kind of a setup movie in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's a good transition as we move into Captain America Brave New World, which is, of course, the fourth film in the Captain America series with Steve Rogers no longer in play. We have a new Captain America. This film is directed by Julius Onah. It stars Anthony Mackie, Danny Ramirez, Shira Haas, Carl Lumbly, Tim Blake Nelson, and everyone's favorite grumpy old man, Harrison Ford.
Everyone's favorite Red Hulk.
Everyone's favorite Red Hulk. Yeah. The fact that he is in a Marvel movie kind of blows my mind. And not because we haven't seen him in franchise films. The man loves himself a good franchise. But the way, at least prior to the last year or so, it feels like he's avoided, like wanting to avoid doing something like this. He just wanted to do Indiana Jones again, and that was about it.
Well, as we'll talk about with this movie, and I may be playing some of my cards early once again, given the level of involvement Harrison Ford has in this movie, he's in quite a few scenes, but it feels as if his work on this movie probably didn't take very long. It kind of feels like he may have been able to fly in, do a couple scenes, get out by 4, maybe fly in again for a few more scenes, and then he was done with the movie. Like, it kind of feels like there's it almost seems like this didn't really take much time out of this schedule to do this movie.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. I mean, typically with the Marvel production, these go on for months and months and months at a time. And even though he's not involved in a lot of the action scenes, is he supposed to be on set every day, even if it lasts 9 monts and he only needs to be there for a few months of it? I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe he was deep faked in a few of them.
Who's to say? Either way, it's exciting that he is in the MCU. I just never would have fathomed that he would join Marvel, but here he is nonetheless as Thaddeus Ross. If you're not familiar with this film, you are, but just in case, it is about Sam Wilson, the new Captain America. He finds himself in the middle of an international incident and must discover the motive behind a nefarious global plan. All right, Brendan, let's dig into this one. What did you think about Captain America Brave New World?
Maybe we should also acknowledge another thing, because we keep talking about how this movie is a movie that's trying to tie up loose ends, mostly loose ends surrounding Marvel Phase 5 and the multiverse saga, and trying to transition into a new direction after the whole Kang Dynasty thing sadly didn't work, right? Well, it's not just doing that. This is also apparently a sequel to The Incredible Hulk. This is also a sequel to Eternals, which I did not expect going into that. That's pretty wild to think. I have some more thoughts about that as we get into it. I don't want to get into that just yet, but this movie is doing a lot. So clearly, as a movie, it's probably not going to work all that well. And the reviews have suggested it doesn't work. Many people, whether they're critics or not, have already expressed their disappointment in the movie. It's the first time a Marvel movie has scored lower than a B cinema score, if I'm not mistaken. I think it got a B minus, which is the lowest cinema score a Marvel movie has ever gotten. So I think that's also telling that people are starting to notice these seams. And I think that's my biggest thing with the movie. I don't think it's a very good movie at all, honestly. It's not my least favorite movie in the MCU, so I'm not going to join the aggressive discourse. I mean, it is no Thor: Love and Thunder. I'll tell you that right now. I much preferred this over Thor: Love and Thunder. I'd put this probably in the same camp as something like Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania or the Marvels, which, again, not really high praise, but there were things about those movies I didn't hate. I didn't really love them as movies. Really, the thing about Brave New World that kind of bothered me the most is that it's probably the MCU film that just feels the most anonymous, I guess, from a filmmaking standpoint, from a directional standpoint. It really feels governed by a committee and a group of writers trying to fix things, and the movie really does feel that way. You can kind of tell where the reshoots happen. You can tell where characters are integrated in and maybe didn't even have a time to share the screen with another character, just edited in a certain way that you could really feel this movie being held together by really thin Scotch tape. That is the final product. But I do think there are interesting ideas here. Some ideas that may have been explored already in the Falcon and Winter Soldier, which maybe we can talk about. I just like it really feels like the seam's breaking. That's really what this feels like. And I can't overlook that.
Okay, Brendan. I don't know. I kind of liked it. I did.
Okay.
I'll admit
it.
I kind of liked it.
But I weirdly don't think we're going to fight about this one, though. I think this is just going to be a matter of like you finding the endearing things that are here and maybe just putting more weight on those things.
Yeah, I can't really defend it, but I did enjoy myself. Now, could it be because I'm a defender of The Incredible Hulk? I think Eternals is one of the best films of Phase 4. Maybe that's what this comes down to. I have stood on the hill for both of those movies for a long time. There's been a lot of people, and you noted this earlier, Brendan, a lot of people talking on social media about how, all of a sudden there are people defending Marvel Phase 1. No.
It's always been great. It's always been great.
I have been defending The Incredible Hulk and Eternals from the beginning. I am an OG defender when it comes to those movies. So when this ended up being a sequel to both The Incredible Hulk and Eternals, I was pleasantly surprised. I did not know that. I did not expect that at all. So I was taken aback in a pleasant way. Now,
there's also an argument that I've seen, and maybe I'll get into this later, if this particular movie even should have been a sequel to those ones. I think that's also a question we can ask too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a sequel to both of those movies, it is effective enough, at least for me. I enjoyed the film bringing up both of those movies, especially given the complaints surrounding both of them as it relates to the Easter egg that was never fully realized in The Incredible Hulk regarding the leader or the Celestial coming out of the Earth, which had never really been addressed up until now. And that's been a lot of the talking points on social media. Yeah. I liked that they finally addressed those things. Should they have done that in a Captain America movie? Probably not. Probably not. I don't know if this was the best place for it, but on its own terms and in a vacuum, I did appreciate it. Now, as a Captain America movie, it does leave something to be desired. The politics injected here are thinly veiled and never really wrestled with. Sam's progression as Captain America and his identity taking up the mantle and feeling ill-suited for the role, that feels a little murky and even a little redundant if you saw Falcon and Winter Soldier.
I agree.
I mean, I'm just a dumb white guy, so take this for what it's worth. But as a black man taking on that symbol of America, this feels like a wasted opportunity. The way it's executed here does come off vapid, and I wish that they chose a lane. Do you want this to be about Sam being Captain America, taking what we saw in Falcon and Winter Soldier and fully realizing, cherry blossoming, if you will, that nice arc in the character? Thank you. I think that would have perhaps been the best route, since this is a Captain America movie after all. And then you have some sort of antagonist that makes sense for Captain America, Sam Wilson, to fight up against.
Yeah.
Instead, while they do trickle that into this film narratively, it primarily functions as a sequel to The Incredible Hulk and Eternals. So I don't think it works great as a Captain America movie. The criticisms are more than warranted. This film is very messy. But as someone who loves Eternals, who loves The Incredible Hulk, I love that the MCU, and it's funny because I feel like those two movies, with Marvel itself and the fans, those are the redheaded stepchilds that no one wants to address and recognize. And yet Marvel is recognizing those movies finally.
Yeah.
And for The Incredible Hulk, it took 15 years for them to finally address that movie as, oh yeah, that's one of our children too.
Yeah, and that's one they didn't have to recognize. You know, I talk about this movie being one that feels the need to tie up loose ends and bring some closure to certain things that weren't working about the multiverse saga. But that's a film that didn't really need to touch all that much, right? Marvel specifically. So I do appreciate them at least recognizing it, that it is, to your point, still one of their children. And the choice to do that alongside Eternals as well, kind of the bastard children of the MCU nowadays. I feel like it's easy to defend the inclusion here because we kind of appreciate those movies. But I can also kind of criticize it for the reasons that you're talking about. We're two white guys on a podcast about a black Captain America, right? We have to at least acknowledge that. I did see some reviews from fellow critics like Robert Daniels over at RogerEbert.com, Rendy Jones over at Rendy Reviews. They very eloquently talked about their problems with this movie, given the fact that it is, you know, finally a black-centric superhero taking up the mantle.
That's not Black Panther.
Right, that's not Black Panther, but the idea of a black hero now taking up the mantle of what was historically a white hero. So that's very much part of it, and within a government that
is still very white,
and would usually utilize these people as just their pawns. So I think those ideas are certainly here. To your point, though, those ideas were probably more eloquently explored in Falcon and Winter Soldier already, but it's hard to overlook the parallels in a movie like Brave New World when the final battle involves the president as a giant red Hulk, right? And also given the fact that the other villain here is a tech guru, right? It's hard to overlook those parallels, whether they were intentional or not, and given the sociopolitical edge it may or may not have. So I can sympathize with those who feel a bit underserved by these ideas. The fact that the movie has this sociopolitical edge that's at least trying for, and instead chooses to focus its energy on two other Marvel properties that don't relate to that thematic idea at all. So in a way, it's almost like Marvel themselves are playing the governmental role as portrayed in this movie, ironically, right? And again, I don't think that's a provocative notion. I think that's merely an accident given the production issues plaguing this movie. But I can certainly sympathize with that criticism given the story that it's telling. Yet I kind of like that Marvel's at least acknowledging some underappreciated Marvel movies. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in a way.
It's very much a double-edged sword. Now, if I had it my way, as much as I do appreciate The Incredible Hulk and Eternals, and that Marvel is finally recognizing those children, that they do exist and that they're good, especially Eternals.
Eternals rocks.
As much as I appreciate that, I would much rather prefer that this explores Sam taking on that mantle and what that means, not just for him personally, but to your point, as you're talking about what that means in the historical context of America, especially when you're bringing back Carl Lumbly as Isaiah Bradley, who, in case you didn't see Falcon and Winter Soldier, he's an African-American Korean War veteran and super soldier who was imprisoned on and experimented on for 30 years. Yeah. And that, is emblematic of a lot of this country in very obvious ways. But here you have an opportunity to address the history of America as it relates to the black community. And now you have Sam taking on this mantle of Captain America. What does that mean in a modern context as it intersects with in a historical context. It was ripe. It was right there for you to do something really, really interesting. And I believe it was Robert Daniels that said that this film was spineless. And I think that is an appropriate word to describe this film, given that opportunity. And Marvel said, we're a little too afraid to address that in 2025, given the current political climate. That is not great. That's not great. So I don't disagree with fans, audiences, critics that are walking out of this loathing this movie or having a lot of problems with it. I do think from a political perspective, this film is quite feeble. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
The only thing I might push back on a little bit,
just a smidgen,
just a smidgen, is some of the criticisms I've read as far as parallels you can draw between this film and, let's say, the politics of the Bush era. And
I've seen that. That's a bit of a stretch to me. Yeah.
Well, I think on its face, it makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Because, when you look at Thaddeus Ross and what he is meant to represent, even though the character is drawn from the comics and he's always been anti-superhero, they're certainly drawing a lot of inspiration from the comics when they first introduced the character in 2008.
Sure.
But that film did come out in 2008 when we're off the heels of the Bush era, right? And I think you can see the militaristic nationalism themes that came out of the Bush era. You can absolutely see that in the Ross character in 2008. That could be a little bit of coincidence, but also not, because America has always had this jingoistic aura, politically speaking, at least on one side of the aisle.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And so Thaddeus Ross has always been emblematic of that. And given what the Bush era was politically, Thaddeus Ross you can certainly draw a lot of parallels there. However, what's interesting about this film is that it attempts to examine how one can change those political views. It is kind of deconstructing that perspective in Thaddeus Ross. That is the whole through line, the whole dramatic and emotional through line of Ross in this film. And I'm not talking about execution. It's whether that works or not.
No, it's the idea that it's at least going for.
That's exactly what it's going for.
Yeah.
And he's having to fight that inner demon, that inner monster, if you will, that was characterized in a Bush era-like way, where he was very pro-America, pro-military. That's the propaganda that I am leashing upon the world.
Yeah.
So I can see the nationalistic parallels. That makes sense to me. But when you couple that into the context of this film, I can't quite agree with the criticisms, because this film is attempting to subvert that nationalism and that change perspective. Can people truly change? I think from a metaphorical perspective, an emotional perspective with Thaddeus Ross here, and I think where it does work for me is the Harrison Ford of it all. I don't know if it all works in the writing, because again, this film is very messy.
Harrison Ford is too good of an actor. He'll be able to fill in those gaps in the script.
And for me, he does. He does. I did feel that emotional conflict in the character.
He's not phoning it
Ford.
in. Yeah, he's not phoning it in at all. And I don't think he's even capable of phoning it in, to be perfectly honest.
No, he's not. So that's where I push back against that criticism a little bit. I see why people would draw those parallels, but this is a film that is actively wanting to deconstruct that idea, and the idea that someone can change their perspective from one side of the aisle to the other, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and it's trying to showcase that change through this idea of cultural unity between two very different demographics, essentially, who probably have
had
very
their
different beliefs.
problems in the past. Yeah.
Exactly. So that idea, they even acknowledge that pretty early in the movie, how that would actually be a huge campaign boost for someone like Thaddeus Ross as president now, being up there standing next to a black Captain America. Like that's talked about very directly. So that idea of cultural unity, it kind of plays a part into what you're talking about with that idea of change. So really, if it does feel very underserved, it comes down to the writing, like you said. And it also really kind of severely serving the Sam Wilson character in some ways too. I really like Anthony Mackie as this character. I don't even dislike him as Captain America. I think it makes sense for him to be the one that Steve Rogers passed the torch, or I guess the shield, onto, right? But I think in a weird way, this movie kind of underserves Captain America himself. And I think that's maybe where the tie-ins to other movies that we like maybe don't have a place here. And that's why it's such a double-edged sword, because I like that Marvel is finally acknowledging those movies, but in a perfect world, they would have done so in a non-Sam Wilson Captain America movie, right? That would have been the most perfect situation. But sadly, they're saddled with doing that here to clean up certain loose ends. And I do think that severely underserves the Sam Wilson side to that argument you're making. But I do think it's at least there from Thaddeus Ross's perspective, primarily because Harrison Ford just knows how to fill in those gaps. He just knows how to do that.
Yeah, no, I do agree. And as we've been talking about, Cap is very much underutilized here. As much as I love the Sam Wilson character, Mackie is really great. And even when it comes to the aspects of the film that I did like, with the film addressing the Incredible Hulk, for example, which is a film I really do admire from Phase One. I think it's underrated.
I think it's fun. I think it's a fun movie.
For Thaddeus Ross to be such a significant part of this film, and obviously he's been sprinkled through a lot of the other films in smaller roles.
Yeah, Civil War, Black Widow, and maybe there's another one that I'm not thinking of.
Maybe one of the Avengers films. I think he might have been in Infinity War, or I think you mentioned Infinity War.
He was in Endgame. I think he was at the funeral
briefly.
At the end.
Yeah. So he's had a small role, and I'm glad that at least he was still a part of it. So they did bring the Incredible Hulk back, aside from Hulk himself, obviously. But they did start to slowly recognize that film more and more. And even Abomination got a cameo in one of the television series. I can't remember which one it was. Was it
She-Hulk? It was She-Hulk, I think it was.
Was it She-Hulk?
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense. So, slowly over the years, they finally started to address that movie. But Thaddeus Ross in this film in a big, big way. And one of the elements, and maybe this is where we can get into spoilers a little bit. Okay. I don't think there's much to this film that we can spoil, but since we're here, there is one element to Ross I do want to bring up. And this admittedly is a bit of a spoiler. So one of the elements he talks about in this film is, like the DNA, the nucleus of him wanting to change is that the ambition in the character and him being so nationalistic and anti-superhero, it is driven a wedge between him and his daughter. Yeah. Who, of course, is played by Liv Tyler in The Incredible Hulk. And we have not seen her in the MCU since that film came out. And here we do see them have a phone call interaction about halfway through the film when he is wanting to genuinely change. I'm not the same person I used to be. And maybe there is some ambiguity to that because of how he was such a proponent for the Sokovia Awards. He's a politician, and we know how politicians are. We don't know exactly how true that is, but again, Harrison Ford gives it such insincerity that you do start to buy it a little bit. And then he has that conversation with his daughter that is really beautiful and tender. And you start to see that change in him. It starts to feel more real and real. And then you get to the end of the film, and again, spoiler alert, Liv Tyler actually comes back for a little cameo here, which I did not expect. A phone call, okay, you can do that anywhere, right? I can record a phone conversation from Marvel in my closet, and they can use it however they wish, right?
Yeah.
For her to come to set, even for a day, maybe a little bit of a different story. Either way, regardless of that, for her to show up did surprise me a little bit. And again, it's a little bit of that, oh, they're addressing the Incredible Hulk. I think that's what I enjoyed about it is they're bringing back something that forever they've tried to ignore. And I did enjoy that element of the character, you know, especially as a politician, as a president, the idea that someone can change, and given what he meant, like thematically speaking, as we were talking about earlier, there is something interesting about that change in the character and what that really means on an emotional level. Again, I wish it was in a different movie. I wish that it was an actual sequel to The Incredible Hulk and not in this film. But again, in a vacuum, I did enjoy it. Yeah.
I did too, even though I also agree that it would have been better if it were in a different movie. I mean, maybe if they just flat out made a Red Hulk movie or something like that, maybe that would have been a more interesting approach. I certainly would have seen that.
Should have been two different movies. It
probably should have been. Yeah, the fusion there is just not happening.
Especially if you're going. And sorry, I know that you're trying to make a point here, but
you're fine.
Especially if they're not going to do an Eternals sequel, which they've talked about how they don't plan on doing another Eternals sequel. Yeah. But if you fuse this Hulk story and Thaddeus Ross story with the Eternals, I feel like that could have worked way more as those two things working congruently than trying to fuse them with also a Captain America story.
Well, that's the biggest outlier. And sadly, this being a Captain America movie, that's the biggest problem. And that's why I'm having a hard time defending this movie more so than I am not. But because I think the sense of place between the Hulk world and this celestial island and the production of Animantium, I think it is, that works. That can at least work. It's the arc of Sam Wilson being thrown in the mix that really doesn't work. And that's the central thing here. To get back to Liv Tyler, I agree with everything that you're saying, but there's one thing I did want to ask you. And maybe it was just, the situation of when I saw it and the theater I saw it in, but something looked off when she showed up on screen. For me, it didn't look real. To me, it looked like a deep fake. Like she was kind of morphed into it via AI or something like that. There was something weirdly off about it. And it kind of took me out of the moment, sadly. And I don't know if you had the same reaction, if it looked genuine, but there was something there was something strange about the integration of her in that scene, and maybe just the overall framing of that particular shot. Something felt a little wonky to me, which is weird to call out that particular scene because this movie is littered with really wonky shot compositions and bad CGI all over the place. Like I said, this movie's held together by Scotch tape, not just in the writing room, but also in the visual effects department, which is really unfortunate given the problems facing many visual effects artists these days. But there is something that I found kind of off about the way she was kind of framed in there. Just it seemed kind of deep fakey in a way, and I don't know if it was. I'm not sure about that.
Well, I will say this: I did see it in IMAX, so the fact that it did not strike me in that way might say something, but I could have just been distracted by what was taking place
like
on
just
screen.
The emotional weight of the moment.
The emotional weight of the moment. We're seeing that character on screen for the first time in 15 years. That could have been enough to distract me from what it was visually, to be fair. And also coming off the heels of that final fight between Cap and Red Hulk, which, to your point, looked awfully gross.
It's horrible.
That last sequence was Citizen Kane compared.
It was more refreshing than whatever that final battle was. Like
it could be accumulation of all of that, and maybe that's why I didn't notice it. I will say though, if you are correct, we will find out real fast because as soon as this comes to digital, the internet will do its thing, and we will see in crisp 4K
Yeah.
if she was a deep fake, because you know how Twitter is. They will make that crystal freaking clear.
They
So,
will uncover it. I mean, Twitter
Yeah.
has basically become the movie version of the FBI in some
Yeah.
ways.
we will find out real fast if you are
Yeah.
correct in that.
But you did call out the final battle between Cap and Red Hulk, which this movie's building towards, and sadly, the marketing really had no choice but to give it away, because it really did feel like Marvel Studios specifically, didn't have much faith in this movie. It's almost like they knew it wasn't very good. So they had a last-ditch effort to include Red Hulk and really market the hell out of his inclusion. Because even in the movie, when it gets to that point, it kind of does feel like a Hail Mary of sorts to really build to something marketable that might get people excited. But even so, despite that potential idea, the execution of that fight scene, I think it might be the worst looking final fight in an MCU film. I really do think it's that bad. It's almost inexcusable, and I hate saying it that way. I don't want to sound cynical because I don't know what the circumstances were as far as how the visual effects artists were worked to put this together and what those circumstances were. But it's really hard for me to not be cynical when it looks like this. Like, it's almost unforgivable, I think.
I think it's bad for a couple of reasons. I think on its own, in a vacuum, it looks quite dreadful. But I think the rest of the film makes it worse in context because, and I do want to perhaps be a little fair here, and this is again where I find the discourse on social media agonizing, because you can't bring up these kinds of arguments. People will just smatter you. They don't want to have a real conversation. They're there for clout. I think the rest of this film comparatively is quite watchable. Now, and what I mean by that is, you look at the sequences there in the church, they're in a tangible building. The fight sequence, the shootout there on the street with, I forget the character's name. What was the character?
Sidewinder, played by Juan Carlos Esposito.
Again, on the street with cars, they're moving around cars. It's tangible.
The editing is probably a problem, but I mean, the tangibility and the sense of place is still okay.
Exactly. You get to the little bunker there. That is all tangible. You can tell they're on an actual set that they had built. It's darkly lit. It's a little eerie, especially as the leader first introduces himself and you have that shadow effect. There's a tangibility to that sequence. The first time it gets real CGI heavy is when you get to the celestial aerial combat that we see. But I don't think that's all that terrible. That's pretty par for the course as far as Marvel's concerned. So I didn't have an issue with that.
Yeah. Again, it was the choreography and the editing that was the problem there.
Yeah. So I think when you couple all of that together, when you get to the Red Hulk Cap fight at the end, where it doesn't look anything like it came before, which perhaps is an element of the reshoots or the Scotch tape effect, as you've been talking about. I don't know. But it doesn't look like anything like the rest of the film. It is really, really bad. So I think on its own, it's not great, but the rest of the film makes it look even worse because there is absolutely nothing tangible about it. I mean, people have been making jokes because it was shot in a parking lot and, you know, it's taking place on the lawn of the White House or wherever that whole sequence takes place. And it's just
like, no, it's
really
not.
bad. It's really, really bad. Now, I'm not here to defend shot composition or editing, to your point. Even in those, aforementioned sequences, I don't think the fight choreography or the editing of those sequences are great. Don't get me wrong. I think as an action film in the MCU, this isn't one of their best. But I at least appreciate that in those other sequences, there is a tangibility to the set design and where all of this is taking place. I didn't feel like I was taken out of the movie. It just wasn't made by the same people that did John Wick, for example.
No,
You know,
it's
like-
and it's never going. I don't think Marvel will get back to that honestly
No.
anytime soon.
I don't think so either.
yeah.
But if you did have that quality of choreography and editing, those other sequences would have been great because there is something practical about them fighting in the hallway or on the street with the cars. Like those felt real. And that's what I do appreciate about this film on the whole is we're moving away from the mysticism of the MCU. We're moving away from space and the multiverse. We are back on Earth where we can ground things more. And I think for the most
Yeah.
part, they do.
It
Is it done well? No. But it's not a CGI fest like a lot of the other films have been.
Well, yeah, and I mean there have been some
Until
quote
the
unquote
end.
CGI fests in the MCU that I think have looked good. It's if anything,
Yeah.
I think I don't disagree with you about some of the utilization of practical sets in the sense of place here and how a little bit more tangible it feels, which is a nice welcome change of pace. And I think because of that, this is not the worst looking MCU film, contrary to popular belief, I guess. It
Mhm.
might be the worst edited, maybe the worst scripted. I will certainly listen to those arguments.
I agree. I
yeah,
agree.
Yeah, but I don't think it's the worst looking from a cinematography standpoint. I would
Yeah.
certainly take this over. This might be a hot take. I don't know. I mean, I'll take this over Deadpool and Wolverine, if I'm being
Oh,
honest.
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah. Just in terms
yeah.
of look, I'm just talking about in terms of visuals. Like when this film comes out on digital, on 4K, you will be able to, and this is where sometimes you can cherry pick, but you'll be able to take screenshots from this film and post it on Twitter and make it look like it's a Citizen Kane masterpiece visually. You'll be able to cherry pick because at times it does look good. Now, again, you can talk about blocking. We can argue that all day. I'm not here to argue blocking. I'm not here to
Yeah.
argue editing. That's very different. And that's why, it's a motion picture, right? So the images are moving. They don't stay as screenshots. But there are moments here, especially in an MCU context, where it doesn't look that terrible. It doesn't until the end. And then it gets not great, we shall say.
Yeah, and even that particular sequence is not that great. But yeah, like I said, I don't think this is the worst looking MCU film overall. I would take it over Deadpool and Wolverine just as far as the
Yeah.
overall look is concerned. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but Deadpool and Wolverine is an MCU movie I'm actually liking less and less as time goes on.
yeah.
It's actually been diminished.
Yeah. No,
Yeah, it's
I
been
agree.
Yeah, that's actually been diminishing for me for quite a while since we reviewed that last summer, I guess that was.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't think this is the worst looking one. I think it has more interesting visual cues than something like the Marvels, for instance. I think the Marvels might be a better constructed movie as far as the staging of just how it tells a story and stuff. But again, like we're talking about movies that I think I'm going to be giving the same grade to on Letterboxd. Pretty much all of these movies that the MCU has been churning out, they've all been sitting in that like 2 to 2.5 out of 5 range for me. That I have such a hard time ranking these now. I don't know where to place them because they're all becoming kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know.
And I think that's perfectly fair. I mean, like I said, I did selfishly enjoy this mostly because I like The Incredible Hulk. And the fact that Marvel is finally addressing The Incredible Hulk, I very much do appreciate that. And same thing with Eternals. And I know we haven't talked about Eternals quite as much in this conversation, but them addressing the Celestial for the first time since Eternals came out, and that's been a running gag forever. So they can at least check that off the box. They addressed it. And not only did they address it, but they talked about how now it is a primal source for adamantium. And that now sets the stage for perhaps X-Men to come into this world in some sort of way. I'm also really curious what that's going to mean for Black Panther and Wakanda.
Yeah.
There's perhaps going to be some sort of political tension now between Wakanda and the rest of these countries that are trying to garner all this adamantium, because vibranium is what separates Wakanda from the rest of the world. That's what gives them a power in terms of the rest of the world. So again, Marvel is setting the stage for them to do something interesting. Will they take advantage of that? Probably not.
No,
But
I don't think so.
the stage is there. And I'm curious what the repercussions of that might be. But that whole sequence there, as an action sequence, I did find that enjoyable. I like that, especially given the whole Sam Joaquin dynamic. I thought was really fantastic. Now,
Yeah.
the political stakes at play, again, I think are not handled good.
I agree, man.
That element of it, I can't defend it. I just
Yeah.
like that they addressed the Eternals of it all. Okay,
Yeah.
that's it.
I like that it's
is the
here.
only thing I can say.
Perfect world. Should have been in a different movie. Should have been Eternals 2. I will take that movie any day.
Yes,
I
it
hope it
should have
happens
been
someday.
Eternals too. Yeah.
I keep forgetting Harry Styles appeared in Eternals. Like people
Mhm,
forget Harry
briefly.
Styles is technically part of the MCU. That's how much.
Yeah.
That's how much we've forgotten about Eternals at this point.
I know it's quite wild, and another element too is talking about wasted opportunity. I think I guess we did bring it up briefly, but another element to the Isaiah stuff that I do think is really great is that there's an element to this film that is the Manchurian Candidate, which
Oh, yeah.
I think is kind of hilarious because I watched the 1960 Manchurian Candidate
Oh, interesting.
last week, not in preparation for this film. I had no clue that there was
Yeah,
gonna be
that was a
correlation.
fluke, wasn't it?
Total fluke. I actually saw Captain America: Brave New World. I think I might have seen it beforehand, but it was already on my list to watch the Manchurian Candidate. Like it just kind of
Okay.
worked out that way.
Gotcha.
Like I had already had Manchurian Candidate pulled up. I saw it Tuesday night. Captain America. I saw it Tuesday night with my son, and Manchurian Candidate was on my list to see. I think the next night. So it was just weird how that worked out. But there is a brainwashed assassin element to this film that, again, is a fascinating idea. I do like that idea. It's just not fully realized here at all
I
because
agree.
it wants
I
to
agree.
be a Hulk movie and an Eternal sequel.
hmm
So I like, again,
It's a
when I
messy
say I
movie.
enjoy this movie, I mean that quite lightly.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm able to separate it. I'm able to easily, in this scenario anyway, separate. I like the Eternals thing. I like the Hulk thing. As a movie on its own terms, there are a lot of problems here.
Well, and I think that's why I'm having a harder time separating it like you are, because so much of this is emblematic of the bigger Marvel problem that's plaguing them, and I want to
And
see
that's
them.
another conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, which I guess maybe we can talk about that. Like, what comes next? Because we obviously have Thunderbolts,
comes. Yep.
and then that's technically the end of Phase 5,
five.
of their movies. I know we're also getting Daredevil and Ironheart, and then Fantastic Four: First Steps is kicking things off for Phase 6, and that's in July of this year. So at least from the movies, like I feel like people have less of a vested interest in whether or not the shows do well as far as their quality, right? Really, at this point now, it's Thunderbolts and Fantastic Four. We already talked about this on a previous show that of these three, Fantastic Four is the one that really needs to do something, right? Like that one needs to be good. Thunderbolts can honestly be whatever. I weirdly have faith that I think it's going to be a better quote unquote movie than Brave New World, but I'm not sure how much better. But Fantastic Four needs to really stick the landing and introduce something that's going to get people excited. If it doesn't, and it's maybe sitting into the same kind of stratosphere as what most of Phase 5 has given us, like what comes next? What happens? Because I feel like if that does happen, Marvel's in deep trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree. I mean, again, when you look at Phase 4 and 5, it's been a little disjointed. It has had no direction. Or, to be fair, they did have a direction and they had to shift part of the way through. And now it's become this multiverse saga. And or not even this multiverse saga, but now they're kind of moving more toward Secret Wars.
I don't
and
even know if we
Fantastic
can call
Four
it a
and all that
saga
stuff.
anymore. It's
Yeah,
like a
either way.
multiversal thing.
It's been kind of all over the place, and there have been very few movies that have moved the needle here. Like, I really like Shang-Chi a lot. I loved Eternals. I don't know if those films moved the needle all that much, although Shang-Chi was at least positively received.
Yeah.
You get to Spider-Man No Way Home. Okay, that was a cultural moment. That one absolutely moved the needle. But part of that was still it was Peter reconciling what happened in Endgame and trying to deal with his grief by uniting with his other Spider-Men.
Yeah.
So it was a little bit of closing the gap from Endgame and also starting the multiverse thing. And it worked in that regard.
Yeah.
Doctor Strange didn't really move the needle. Thor Love and Thunder certainly didn't. Black Panther Wakanda Forever sort of did. And that was pretty well received. And then you get to phase 5, and the only film here, assuming Thunderbolts, is going to be another Brave New World. And who knows? I would love to be surprised and eat crow here.
Me too.
But assuming that it's another Brave New World, the only film in phase 5 was Guardians of the Galaxy 3. That one people really liked a lot, and it capped off that trilogy in a really great way. The Marvels I liked, but again, similar to Shang-Chi
move
or
the
Eternals,
needle,
it
as you're
didn't really
saying.
move
Yeah.
the needle. Exactly. Deadpool and Wolverine, I guess you could argue moved the needle, but that film wasn't all that great.
It moved the financial needle.
The financial needle.
It got
It was
people
a-
in the theater to see it.
It was a bit of a cultural thing, so I do
Yeah.
want to be fair to the film. It did hit culturally
Yeah.
and financially, for
Yeah.
sure. But it's also not very good. And even if you want to consider that moving the needle, how much does it really move the needle when it's on the fringes, as we talked about earlier? Is it really MCU or isn't it? So in terms of the momentum of the MCU, I think that film is TBD even on moving the needle.
Yeah.
At this point, phase 4 and 5 has done very little for the MCU. And that's just on the film side, let alone the TV stuff, as we talked about earlier, that has been quite challenging and just muddled the waters further. So that is to say, I agree with you. Fantastic Four, I hope, is a complete shift for Marvel. One could hope.
I hope
But
so.
I don't know.
Well, because I said this before, and I think on a previous show. So for those listening, forgive me if this just sounds like white noise again. But if Fantastic Four does not work, and I think it's going to be a big hit. I think they're marketing that one very well thus far. So I think that's the one that has a decent potential to be part of the $1 billion club when it comes to the MCU. But whether it's good or quote unquote moves the needle, I don't know yet. But if it's not, and it's plagued by a lot of the same problems we keep talking about with Marvel, I think there's a very good chance that Marvel still continues on with Doomsday and Secret Wars, because at this point they're kind of obligated to. But once Secret Wars is done, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a completely long pause afterwards, just to try to fix things or reboot things. There's a good chance that what Endgame should have been, as far as closing the gap on a particular saga, is what Secret Wars will end up doing because it's obligated to. It might end up getting to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And even as we get to phase 6, while, and we somewhat debated the trailer for the Fantastic Four First Steps, I do really like how it looks. I think there's a lot of potential here with this cast.
Sure.
I don't know what to make of Matt Shakman. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Forgive me.
Yeah.
He's done a lot of TV. And like I mentioned earlier, I loved WandaVision. I thought that was really, really great. One of the best entries in the MCU.
And he directed every
spearheaded
episode of that.
He spearheaded that. Absolutely. So he hasn't done a lot of film. I think this is only going to be his second movie, but he's done a lot of TV. So
Is
he's
it?
been around for a while. Yeah.
Did he actually make a movie already? I didn't even know that.
I don't know. I'm looking at his filmography. I don't know if it was a feature length or a short film, to be perfectly honest. It just notes that there was another film here. Yeah, it's 92 minutes long. It was distributed by A24, believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah, Cut Bank is the name of it. And this was 2014, so this would have been early A24. That
What
is
the heck,
hilarious.
Matt
I didn't even
Shankman?
look at that element of it until I clicked on it here. I mean, that's a film that stars Liam Hemsworth, Bruce Dern, Billy Bob Thornton, Michael Stuhlbarg. I mean, John Malkovich. Never saw this film, but a hell of a cast.
Why haven't I heard of this thing?
I
mean,
don't
it's.
know.
I mean, I know
Yeah.
it's sitting at a pretty low Metascore, so it's probably not. It might not be
And that's
great,
probably why I didn't see it. It probably
Yeah.
got not great reviews.
but I didn't know about this. Okay.
Yeah. James
Interesting.
Newton Howard did the score. I'm gonna have to check this out.
I want to see what Matt Shackman has up his sleeve in the cinematic realm.
Seriously. I mean, given that cast and the people he's working with, I cannot imagine that film is that bad. But anyway, I'll have to check that out later. But that is to say, this is only his second movie. And I'm curious what he's able to do with it. But the other thing, and this speaks to your larger point about the MCU, having a good filmmaker in there has sometimes mattered and sometimes it hasn't.
Right.
A lot of the time it's kind of in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
You
You could still feel that a great filmmaker who has their own vision and has their own way of doing things are still kind of shackled by the by just the MCU thing that they have to rely on, and you feel that all the time.
I felt Raimi more than you did, but I will acknowledge though that it's like Doctor Strange wasn't full on Raimi like the Spider-Man movies.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely, he was shackled to a degree. Even if I felt him more than you did, Chloe Zhao a little bit of the same way. Like there's a lot of Chloe Zhao there, but
I agree with that. Yeah.
yeah. So that is to say, like at times, I think they let their directors play more than their reputation suggests. But I just don't know. I am hoping that with Phase 6, because of what's at stake, maybe not financially. These films have always done fairly well.
Sure.
But in terms of fan engagement and people staying on board with you, I think there's a lot at stake there still.
Yeah. Well, I do wonder how Captain America Brave New World is going to fare. A lot of the narrative out there is that it has done very well in its opening weekend, but like enough to at least make its budget back. But that's not much, right? For a Marvel movie. Like given that budget, it needs to make 2.5 times that in order to be at least profitable. And given the low cinema score that it's received, I don't know if the word of mouth is going to be there to really carry it over the finish line.
There.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I agree. I mean, I think it might struggle.
It might struggle.
It still has work to do. And is it going to be a little bit of that Moana thing where, okay, it comes out strong, obviously not as strong as Moana 2, but
right.
It comes out of the gate not terribly. I mean, this could have done much worse than it did. It did fine on its opening weekend, but Moana 2 did not have any legs, and partially because it did not get good word of mouth.
Yeah.
And the reviews were a little lukewarm. Is this going to suffer the same fate? And if it does, that is not good financially because it still has work to do.
It has work to do.
Break even.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if that could end up being a turning point for Marvel when they see that it doesn't do well. If there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and I'm never advocating for a movie to not do well. I want people to get paid for the work that they put into it. But at the same time, if this movie doesn't do the numbers that Marvel and Disney wants, that could be a rude awakening for them to recognize, okay, maybe this isn't working. We have to do something different now. People are starting to take notice at how much we're cutting corners here, and we can't hide it anymore. So, again, double-edged sword.
It is a double-edged sword. If they have a big loss, it'll force them to reevaluate, and artistically, that would hopefully mean good things. Or would they take the wrong lessons and cheapen the cost?
Which they've done many times.
More stuff like AI and things like that. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say. And I don't know if it's opened everywhere quite yet. I mean, it's open internationally and domestically, but I don't know if it's open in every market to this point.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good question.
We'll see. We'll see. And the reason I asked that is because the international numbers are still pretty low comparatively. So it makes me think that there's more international markets for it to open still. But we'll
Wonder
see.
how
We'll see.
Japan feels about this movie, given the central conflict of America versus Japan that potentially forms here.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. And it's kind of, I don't know. Like, I don't know why they picked Japan. I think it's
I know, seriously, it seems
interesting
kind of
that they
random.
picked-
It was like a random country generator.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's because they don't want to antagonize country. I don't know. I guess I don't want to get too political. In that
Yeah,
regard,
let's not specify anything that we don't want
But
to get
yeah,
in trouble
picking
for.
Japan was a bit weird. It admittedly was a bit weird. My last thought on this: when is the MCU going to get back to having good scores in their films?
They had a moment. They had a moment where it's like, okay, they started to listen to that criticism, and then they started bringing on Michael Giacchino for a few films, and he brought some really good scores to films that maybe films I didn't fully love, but the music to them was great, like with Doctor Strange or with Spider-Man: Homecoming, right? Michael Giacchino's coming back for Fantastic Four, and some of the stuff we've heard already sounds really
looking
great.
forward to that. No, Giacchino coming back looks great.
But you can't rely on Giacchino to be the only one that gives us good film scores for these, right?
Yeah, I mean, I did like the work for No Way Home. I liked the work for Eternals.
Yeah.
Haven't cared for much since then.
I'm trying to think. Yeah, I might agree with you as far as musical scores are concerned.
Guardians had its moments. Guardians
did.
Moments.
Yeah, I think the Guardians trilogy was overall pretty well scored.
I didn't completely hate John Murphy's work there, but I wouldn't say that I was wowed either. I wasn't wowed by it.
I mean, as much as I don't love the film as much as most people, and maybe even you, I would say the musical score for Doctor Strange and Multiverse of Madness isn't that bad.
Oh, yeah. Again, I'm not going to sit here and say that, oh my God, this was actively bad, but I wasn't wowed either. And I say that because a lot of Phase 1 and Phase 2 have extremely memorable scores. Extremely memorable.
Yeah, I still randomly hum the theme from Jon Favreau's Iron Man. At least that flight theme.
That Iron Man score I listen to still. That first Thor score, the first two actually different composers.
Yeah, Patrick Doyle, I think was the
my God, slayed that score. Absolutely killed it. Was incredible. The aforementioned Incredible Hulk, I think, was very good. I mean, almost all of Phase 1 had memorable scores, crystallizing with that iconic Avengers theme when you get to that first Avengers. But even in Phase 2, like Henry Jackman's Winter Soldier score, oh my God, it is phenomenal.
I love that score. Yeah, honestly, one of my biggest problems with Captain America: Civil War was that Henry Jackman didn't reprise some of those themes from the Winter Soldier.
I know. I agree. I agree. I was a little disappointed with that. I wanted him to reprise some of those.
That was a huge missing ingredient for that movie.
I agree. And I love that film, but I don't disagree with that idea. So like Phase 1 and Phase 2 were full of these memorable scores.
They gave us movies. That's the thing. They didn't give us content. Yeah, they didn't give us content. That's why we still love Phase 1, because we were going to see cinematic events. We weren't going to pay $30 a ticket to see an episode of a television show, which is what it feels like now.
Yeah, and I don't know, like this is a trend I've noticed generally. Now there are outliers, of course.
Yeah.
Generally though, a lot of blockbusters that we've gotten over the last 5 years, and maybe it's because they're pandering to content or they're trying to shift musically in some sort of way to not bring a distraction to the movie. I don't know what the case is, but a lot of scores from big movies, it's not just the MCU, a lot of big movies have very forgettable scores.
Yeah, this is not an MCU problem.
It's not
just
an MCU
easy. It's
problem.
just easy to point the finger at the MCU because, at least for the most part, they're the ones mostly oversaturating the market with these types of films, right?
Yeah.
Excuse me. So it's easy to point the finger at them more so than anything else. But it's not just the musical scores; it's also just visually. We're noticing a lot of blockbusters catering to how they're going to transfer to the digital realm, right? That it almost seems like they're cutting visual corners as well. Just it's just more noticeable with Marvel. I think they're the ones worst at hiding it.
No, I completely agree. And that's been my issue with a lot of blockbusters. But since we're talking about Marvel, I've been very disappointed since Endgame. A lot of these scores have been very middling, very, very middling, with a few exceptions. And I'm sure Giacchino will be one of those exceptions. It's been disappointing.
I like the music for Loki. I think Loki as a
Well,
show
okay.
was more cinematic than anything that Marvel has given us in Phase 4 or Phase 5. Maybe with the
Loki,
exception of
yeah.
like Eternals or something like that.
No, I agree. The score to Loki, that opening theme, I think was really great. I really hope they bring that opening credits theme back for Daredevil because, man, that went really hard too.
That was good.
So I hope they bring that back. I don't know if they will, since it is a rebirth after our reborn, however they're labeling
Born
it,
again,
but
yeah.
born again, yeah, something along those lines.
Something born a second
Something
time.
born. Yeah, but generally, like across the board, it just leaves a lot to be desired. I would just want to see Marvel get back to having composers, and maybe this is them, trying to save money. Let's just get out a quick score. Who cares if it's good or not? I don't know. I'm very much inferring here. I don't know. Maybe
think
they are
it's-
actually trying and it's just not working. I don't know.
I think it's a matter of trying to get people who are trying and don't have enough time to put the right kind of effort in.
Yeah.
I think is what's happening in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and again, nothing. I don't know Laura Cartman all that much. I know she's won Emmys for her work, so I'm sure she's a very talented composer and musician. I'm not doubting that at all. But
Well-
a Captain America movie, and the Captain America movies have had memorable scores, as you just noted, and there was not a single note in this film that I could hum, that I could remember, that moved me at all. It was very banal.
They
It wasn't bad necessarily.
yeah.
I wasn't distracted by, oh my God, that's a terrible score. But I just couldn't even tell you what
all
the core, what the cues were.
all of Marvel's effort, musically speaking, at least for Phase 5, has gone into composing The Witch's Road from Agatha all along, because that's really the only memorable thing that they've given us.
Yeah. There's been moments. That's about it. There's been a few moments. Yeah. Phase 5 especially was yikes.
Rough.
Yikes.
Well,
Yeah.
if we're gonna
all
end
the
on a
whole-
positive note, Agatha all along, underrated show. That was good.
I did like it. Yeah. The music for Thunderbolts though is Son Lux. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right.
Okay.
But I like them as a band, and I'm curious what they bring.
That
so-
is very. I did not know that. That is an interesting choice.
Yeah. Am I saying that right? Is that how that's pronounced?
I need to look up.
I
the
mean,
name.
I'm
Son-
familiar with the band because I've heard their stuff before, but I don't know if that's how
Yeah,
it's
Son.
pronounced.
It's Sun Lux, I think is because we've seen or we've at least heard some of their music in movies like Looper, for instance, Paper
Yeah.
Towns. So
Yeah.
they're not unfamiliar. That's
Yeah, they did
I'm-
Everything Everywhere All at Once as well.
I
which
am
like.
always curious when a musical group is doing the score for a movie. I like to see those. I don't want to see it more often because I kind of like how it's kind of like a needle in a haystack kind of situation.
Mhm.
But I like when that happens because it's always an interesting choice. Whether it works or not, I'm always intrigued by the idea.
I'm intrigued too. So
Mhm.
from what I've heard from them, I don't like actively seek them out, but when they come across my
Well,
playlist, and
okay.
especially on a film side, like I've enjoyed their work. So
Well, maybe Thunderbolts might be pretty fun.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they had an appearance in The Disappearance of Eleanor Rigby. How exciting.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, I've definitely heard them before, and I recognize the name. I've liked them. I've liked their work. So I am curious. Maybe that means that Thunderbolts will kind of break the trend a little bit.
Maybe it'll actually feel like a movie.
Yeah. All right, we've gone really long here, so we'll go ahead and end Captain America: Brave New World there. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, please leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. You can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. All right. We have another review coming this week. It is Paddington in Peru. We did a Harrison Ford draft on the main show this week. So go and check that out. There's going to be a new Chasing the Gold this week where Shadon and company talk about BAFTAs. And there's going to be new Women in Session as well.
Yep.
If you want to support the show, you can become an In Session Film VIP. That is patreon.com/InSessionFilm. If you're watching on YouTube, become a member of the channel. Apple Podcast subscriptions. We have bonus content that we are putting out every month that you have exclusive access to. And it's a really great way to support the show as well. With that, Brendan, any final thoughts as we get out of here?
I want Marvel to work again. That's all. And Phase 1 rules. Phase 1 has always ruled. It's great.
Completely agree. Phase 1's awesome. I've enjoyed a lot of Phase 2 as well. And I think they stuck the landing with Infinity War and Endgame for the most part. I do want to see them get back to that. I have enjoyed these movies. Of course, they've had bumps in the road, but I've enjoyed them.
Yeah.
And this is the only space where I feel comfortable saying that. I don't know if I would go on Twitter and say this, honestly.
Oh, you might get blocked. You might get ostracized. You'll get canceled.
I mean, exactly.
Imagine having to explain people why you got canceled. I liked a Marvel movie.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh, I know. God forbid. So anyway, I feel space to nerd out here, and I do hope that they get back to where they were, because Captain America: Brave New World is not it. Not it. Not the answer. So anyway, with all that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Do feel bad for Mackie, though.
Hulk in Eternals.
Hopefully he'll lead the Avengers to something great. To the promised land.